Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 115 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Rebecca Soffer for this episode. And Rebecca is not a widowed parent, but many widowed parents and others turn to her book and her community, Modern Loss, for support and connection. And now Rebecca has a brand new book out this week, the Modern Loss Handbook. It's a beautiful full-color book, and Rebecca calls it an interactive guide to moving through grief and building your resilience. Some of the topics Rebecca and I discuss include the time she and I met at an event at the Riveter in Seattle on her first book tour back in 2018, how lonely and disorienting it was when both of her parents died when she was in her early 30s, why she founded Modern Loss 8 years ago, and why it's important to normalize the conversation around grief and loss, tips from her new Modern Loss Handbook for finding support, some ways that grief can impact friendships, creating bespoke holidays to remember our loved ones, and why we should all create our own grief manifesto. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Rebecca Soffer. Hey there, you may have heard about my book, Future Widow. What's it about, you ask? Well, first, my young husband started feeling dizzy and stopped making sense. And the next thing I knew, I was a widowed parent, desperately wanting to know how exactly do you raise grieving kids anyway? And that's what Future Widow is about. In the book, which has endorsements from many prominent children's grief experts, my family's story is told as a memoir, but I've explicitly worked in themes about parenting grieving kids to make it broadly applicable, including to those who are becoming widowed parents today. Readers have said it's captivating, that they couldn't put it down, that it's an honest and hopeful read, and that it's a must-read for anyone facing loss. Find Future Widow at futurewidowbook.com. That's futurewidowbook.com. And thank you. My guest today is Rebecca Soffer. Rebecca is co-founder of Modern Loss, a global movement offering creative, meaningful, and practical content and community addressing the long arc of grief. She is the author of the new book out this week, the Modern Loss Handbook. She is also co-author of the book Modern Loss, Candid Conversations About Grief, Beginner's Welcome. Rebecca is joining us today from Massachusetts. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Jenny. I'm really glad to be here.
Thanks. I've really been looking forward to speaking to you, and I should say seeing you again. We actually met, I must have been back in 2018 when you were launching your first book, and you were on a book tour, and you came to the Riveter in Seattle and did an event there, which was terrific. And I remember telling you that I was thinking about getting this podcast started, and in fact did get it started later that year. And you were very encouraging, so thank you for that. And I'll have to see if I can find the picture. It's probably maybe on my previous phone or something. Dig it out and see if I can find that, because that would be a lot of fun.
Oh, I would love to see that. I loved that event so much. I mean, I loved going to the Riveter. I love that community of women. I loved it. Like, my former acupuncturist came because she lives in Seattle now. and it was really great because she knew me like way back when, like really soon after my mom died. And I was like, my body was just flipping out, and she was like giving me acupuncture. And so it was actually really, I remember that night because she's like, wow, you've come really far.
Nice.
Yeah, that was a great night. I got to get back to Seattle.
Yes, please do. And holler when you come out here. That was probably one of the first like book launch events that I went to, one of the first grief kind of talk events that I went to. So that was really fun. So you mentioned that you're acupuncturist and seeing you after your mom died. So let's just jump right into this, because you're not a widowed parent, which is totally fine. I know my listeners are primarily widowed parents, but can you tell us how did you get involved in this grief world?
Yeah. Everyone's entry point is a little different. And my entry point in terms of like very deep grief, obviously like not obviously, but I had grandparents who died. My two grandfathers had died, by the time I was 11. I had a friend actually who had died, who I had made in Israel, who was killed in a helicopter accident, actually military training accident when I was a teenager. Beyond that, though, I didn't really have any, like nuclear family, or just like extremely close losses. My grandparents, one died when I was 2 and one had been very sick for my whole life. And so my real entry point was in 2006 when my mom was killed in a car accident. I was working, full time, building up my career in New York City. I was working in daily television for a comedy show of all things. I had just gone on vacation with my parents. For a week, we had gone camping and they dropped me off at my apartment. And then an hour later, I got a phone call that all was not well. And I had to get my way to a hospital in the middle of New Jersey in Princeton. And that's where my dad was there and told me that my mom hadn't survived this terrible accident that had happened.
Wow.
And that was like, shoe number 1 dropping. I gather that we'll talk a lot about what happened between these bookends, but shoe number 2 dropping was 4 years later when my dad died from a heart attack. So within 4 years, both my parents died.
Okay.
Not my plan.
No. Well,
definitely not my plan.
I'm sure. Yes. How old were you at those times?
I was 30 and 34.
So young.
I felt young. I felt like a little kid.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of your listeners could definitely relate to that feeling. You're like, oh, but I'm this adult. I'm supposed to be with it. I'm supposed to be resourced. But you just feel like a tiny, tiny child when this stuff happens to you.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I imagine that some of my listeners might be young widows themselves, maybe close to the age you were, and they have maybe very small kids. And some of my listeners might have kids who are maybe approaching the age, college age or mid-20s, approaching the age that you were when your parents died. So how was that? I gather it must have been unmooring.
Yeah, I mean, it was awful. It was terrible. I don't even think I had the wherewithal to use very elegant words like unmooring, in those first early days. I think I would describe it as like a total shit show where I just was like flung into this new universe that I didn't understand or recognize. And I had to figure out new ways to kind of talk to my dad and relate to my dad, because, all of a sudden our kind of our axis was off kilter. My mom had been the grounding presence in our lives and she was no longer there. And so we were spinning off our different axes. And it was hard. I was working full time in New York City. He was in Philadelphia. I was surrounded by coworkers every day. They didn't know what to do with me. And they were awesome people. I'm still good friends with many of them. It's just that, like, what do you do when someone you work with every day and you laugh with every day and you put pressure on every day, is faced with like a profound loss? Like, how do you treat them? What do you say? And so a lot of people just like didn't really say anything because they didn't know what to say because we're really bad at this stuff. And so, yeah, it was really lonely. I would say honestly, that's like the word that I can use above all others. It was really lonely. Even in a world in which I had a lot of friends, it was really lonely. I felt like the little prince standing on his own planet.
Did I read somewhere that you also don't have any siblings?
Yeah, I'm my parents, I'm the only child between my mom and my dad.
Gotcha.
So I didn't even have like, a sibling who I could say, oh, remember this, remember when mom did this. I mean, not even just like the memory and the connection stuff, which is so important, especially across the long term. That gets even more important, but especially in the short term, I didn't even have like a logistical partner who could like help me through all of this, like the death certificates, the choosing of the outfit that she was going to wear for all eternity, the funeral arrangements, the eulogy writing, the, worrying about my dad and who's going to check on him. I mean, it was definitely like on me.
Right. Yeah.
And I had to go to work.
Right. That's a lot. That is a lot. So did this somehow then lead you into forming Modern Loss? Tell us how that got started.
Yeah. I mean, it's very safe to say that I would have definitely not done anything like this had I not had this personal experience. I would have absolutely pursued a career in journalism, in production. I went to Columbia Journalism School for graduate school. That was my path. I'm a writer, I'm an editor, I'm a publisher. I'm not a grief expert, right? But am I? All of a sudden I am, as is everybody who lives with loss, right? I'm no more of an expert than any other person. I have my own personal expertise in my hand that I was dealt and how I've moved through it and grappled with it and learned from it and grown from it. And so I felt for so long so unseen in like the actual experience of grief and like how it doesn't end after a year and how you still really can struggle after 3 years, and it could be like 4 steps forward, 1,000 steps back, and vice versa. I struggled with finding like real life examples of people who could show me what, their grief looked like and how I wasn't alone in it, and how, what resilience looked like and what ritual looked like, and new ritual and memory, like remembrances. Like I just needed examples, and I needed them to be shown to me in a way that like was not attached to any platitudes or any assurances or any cheesy crap. I just needed people to tell me their stories, because I like reading. I'm a journalist. I like reading stories. I like sharing stories. Yeah. That's what I wanted. I didn't need to like self-diagnose, which is what I was doing late at night. I was like reading like the DSM-4 at the time. And I'm like, oh my God, I have all these things. And I just really needed a friend. I needed a grief friend. I needed a community. And I needed someone who could really fill in where the therapy could not reach, which is, beyond that hour. Or really, let's be honest, a lot of times it's like 45 minutes. Right. And beyond, whatever work I was doing there, I needed like a really full circle approach to living with loss, because I was alive in the big bad world. Right. And I really had to figure my shit out. Yeah. And so Modern Loss came out of that, which was just me getting really tired of that stuff not existing, at least where I was looking for it, and starting it as a website, as a publication with my friend Gabby Berkner 8 years ago. So it's been in existence since 2013. Which is crazy when I think about it. Yeah. So if someone heads over to Modern Loss right now, what will they find? They'll find, like upwards of 1,000 original personal essays and resource pieces and, practical pieces. They'll find advice column. They'll find, special columns on like grief in the body, which we call grief bacon. And, it's not like divided like mother loss, father loss, spouse loss. Yeah, there are like some drop down menus, but there are tags where you could like, search by tag. But for the most part, what we're trying to show is that grief kind of crosses across all types of, death, loss, and relationships. And while, yes, there definitely is a need for specific communities. Like I absolutely am a member of the Dead Moms Club, like 1,000,000%. And then I'm also a member of like the Dead Moms Who Died Suddenly Club. Just like you're a member of the Widow Club, and like, or you're a hot young widow, like little nod to my pal Nora there.
Yeah. Nora McInerney.
Who's a real good friend of mine. And so, but yes, like you do need those like specific circles, but also you shouldn't limit yourself to them, because you should realize that you can really find community and like witnessing and bonding and levity and encouragement in other people who have been through something. Like you're going to bond with somebody if they're sharing a story of like jealousy or wistfulness or struggle or hilarity, regardless of whether, their husband died or they had a miscarriage. We're just trying to really normalize the conversation around storytelling about grief and loss and help people to create community around it, so that they can feel comfortable sharing their own narratives with the people who they see every day.
Terrific. Okay, well, I encourage readers or listeners to check that out, and I'll put a link in the show notes for sure to that. And I think that your first book, Modern Loss, is a bit of an outgrowth of that, right? It's different essays by different people. Can you just tell us a little bit about that book?
Yeah. So the first Modern Loss book, which is called simply like our tagline, Modern Loss, Candid Conversation About Grief, Beginner's Welcome. I co-authored it with Gabby Berkner. It came out in 2018, and I'm extremely proud of it because that was like a real communal experience. You know, like Gabby and I both wrote extensively for it. But at the same time, we commissioned and invited 40 different people to submit their essays about, you know, one narrowly focused aspect of the long arc of loss. And it's divided up into different sections like triggers and identity and collateral damage and intimacy, you know, but you have all types of people. Like we have very well-known people. I'm trying to think of famous widows. Lucy Kalanithi, whose husband Paul wrote When Breath Becomes Air, and who's a beautiful writer in her own right and a physician to boot, like no big deal. She wrote a beautiful piece about like what she ended up doing with her wedding gown after Paul died. And it's a really awesome piece. Like you would not have thought that it would have ended up the way it ended up. And, you know, then we have people who are not public figures at all, who just have something really important and compelling that they need to say, like the hairdresser from Worcester, Mass, who wrote this great piece about like how, well, everyone thinks she's a hairdresser, but really she's like an Oscar level winning actress, because every damn day she goes into that job and she pretends that she has two sons and she talks about them because her job is to chit chat. But what nobody knows is that one of them died from an overdose. And so like, you know, all these rich stories, you know, a lot of them are really funny too, because there's a lot of humor in the long arc of it all. So I'm really proud of that one. And that's also like heavily illustrated. You know, it's a great book. My new one is very different.
So that's okay. So terrific. So thank you for telling us about the first one. And I'll put a link, of course, in the show notes. So that brings us to the new book, The Modern Loss Handbook, an interactive guide to moving through grief and building your resilience. So tell us, why did you write this one?
So this one I wrote because I felt over the years that I had been learning so much, not just about like through my own personal experience with loss, which was shifting all the time and evolving and changing, and my relationship with my parents, which was changing and evolving as time went on, as I got married and became a parent and, you know, became more of an entrepreneur. And my dad was an entrepreneur, but then he wasn't around to talk to. And then I was a parent, but my mom wasn't around to talk to. So I was like, oh gosh, I'm learning so much about like ways in which I can stay connected to them. And then I'm also learning so much about like ways that I can stay connected to myself, like through treating my mind better, my body better, through figuring out how to get better sleep and like grounding mechanisms and therapy and like DIY therapies. And then I'm also figuring out how to stay connected to the world around me. Like it had been years and I had to really figure out, how do you work while you're living with loss? You know, like how do you deal with friendships and navigate intimacy? How do you do all that stuff? Like you still have to live out in the world. And I was like, well, these seem to be like the three pillars of like what you need to do in order to build as some people call it, post-traumatic growth, and really build your resilience and figure out a way to like find and create meaning from like the mess of it all. And so I was like, I got to write this thing. And I wanted it to be interactive. I didn't want it to be a journal. I wanted it to be a book that you could write in. And that's what it is. It's a book that I wrote. I had wanted to write it before the pandemic, like long story short, didn't, but it was all in my head. And so last winter in that, you know, first real long winter of COVID, and the election and everything, it was a long winter.
It was.
Yeah, right. That's when I wrote it. And I feel like it was a much richer experience, not just to write it, but to see what came out, because of the intense grief that the whole world was experiencing. And because now I had spent many, many months pivoting all of Modern Loss to like online and virtual sessions and support sessions and starting a newsletter, and like all out of necessity because of the pandemic. So I feel like, what came out of me in terms of this book was maybe like it kind of happened when it had to happen, and so I'm proud of it. And so it's definitely like a heavily written book. It's not like a journal or a workbook, but there's a lot of places where you can write in it because there's a lot of prompts and there's a lot of exercises. There are even grief stickers, which
I saw that. Yes.
Got some and why not?
Like in the back, there's a page. Yeah. I was flipping. Now listeners can't see, I'm flipping through here. It's a beautiful book, full color.
Yeah.
Inside as well as of course the outside.
It's very colorful. And we hired an amazing illustrator, Elizabeth Graber, who is just phenomenal. And and I feel like that was also key. Like I really needed whichever publisher I was with to understand why this needed to be full color, very rich, like very bright, something that's like counterintuitive to like what you would think a grief book would look like, something that would sit on your coffee table and look really pretty and cool because you're allowed to like good design and still be grieving. Like that's cool.
Right. And I should say it does not look like something that was printed by a funeral home or by Hallmark or something like that. It doesn't. The style is cool. Yeah, cool. All right. When I was reading here, I think this was maybe towards the beginning, and I'm just going to read a quote, one of the sentences. You said, what I hope you know, and what I hope this book helps you remember, is that your relationship with your person isn't over just because they're dead, and your own life has enormous potential for richness.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the stuff you were just talking about reminded me of that. Can you tell us a little bit about, let's start with the first part. Your relationship with your person isn't over just because they're dead. Tell us about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like part of what I had alluded to a few minutes ago about how I noticed as time went on, and it definitely wasn't like the first few months or maybe even the first several months that I realized that, my mom is still my mom and my dad is still my dad. And that's like, whenever someone says like, oh, what were their names? I always say, well, my mom's name is Shelby. It's not like she like lost her name. It's not like she became like corpsey, like she's Shelby, she's still Shelby. It's like says it on her headstone. So like when, like I want very much her to have a real live name because names don't die. And so it took me a really long time to realize, like that, like as I was moving through life, that I was regarding them in different ways. And I was kind of, seeing them in different ways and needing them in different ways, and relating to them in different ways, because that's what you do. That's the point of life. You move through it and you're supposed to ebb and shift and flow and crash and burn and build up again. And, I really, started to appreciate that, like, and it kind of like was a comfort to me as like a non-religious person that I really could feel like my relationship was still there, like it was like having her very much with me and in me. It doesn't make it anywhere near, like what it would be to have her with me in person and like be able to go out to dinner. But I do believe that I have a relationship with her, and it'll be interesting to see what happens as I get older, and maybe I get closer to the age that she died. And same with my dad, but I definitely believe that relationships go on. I do.
Well, that's an interesting point you mentioned. It reminds me of when I spoke with Hope Edelman and her books, and I know you've worked with her on some things, and she talks about how it is a thing that when you get to that age that your parent died, it can be triggering. It can be all kinds of stuff.
It's true. Yeah. I mean, I'm not there yet, but I would assume that it would be very, like a good friend of mine was hospitalized with COVID last month, and her mom had died from COVID in May of 2020. And I was terrified. She's a very dear friend of mine. And I was very, very scared and very nervous for her. And then I realized, oh my God, like her mom died from this thing in the hospital 2 years ago. And I was like, wait a minute, not only like, oh my God, are you okay? But like, how are you? And she said the worst part of this entire thing was laying there, imagining what my mom must have been going through and how alone she was too.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Like that is intense, dude.
Yeah. Yeah. The second part of the sentence, after your relationship isn't over with the person just because they're dead. The second part, you said your own life has enormous potential for richness. I think that's interesting, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is what it is. It's like, eventually when you're living with grief, I think everyone has to make a personal decision for themselves, which is like, what am I going to do with this? Like, am I going to stay? Am I going to stick around? Am I going to, like, I'm not saying that everybody, gets to a point where they want to take their own lives, but, a lot of people wouldn't mind being hit by a Mack truck if it just happened to come down the street. I absolutely had moments where the pain was so deep that I was like, oh, I just like honestly don't want to feel anymore. But I never had any. No, I never had any plan to do anything about that, but the pain was so deep. And I was like, I just don't want to live with so much pain and sadness. And, I think that just like, I got to this point eventually where I had finally built the right team of, a therapist and somebody who was helping me do like EMDR, which is for trauma, and like starting to find the right friends that I could talk to. And I was like, oh, I'm like building my team. Like I'm really building my support crew here. Yeah. And once I saw this glimmer of hope in its existence, I was like, okay, maybe I can get through like, maybe I can do this, and, maybe, I can live a good life. And I don't exactly know how that's going to happen, but like, I really want to, like, I'm 30, like, I really want to live a good life. I want to meet someone. I want to have kids. I want to have a house. I want to build a career. I want all those things. I'm not going to have them with the person and then the people that I thought I'd have them with, but like, how can I do that? And how can I do it in a way that like is kind to myself and doesn't beat myself up all the time? And, allows me to find joy, because I deserve it. I'm alive. I'm a living person. I deserve to find joy and feel like life is worth it. And so I kind of made this promise to myself that I was going to do anything humanly possible to make that happen.
Terrific. Turning to the book for a second, you've got it's broken up in different chapters. I noticed that one of the chapters is on finding support, and you're just mentioning building a team around yourself. And there was, I think it's got you talk about different types of therapy and group things, and also some DIY support things. And it strikes me that maybe some of the modern loss community might fall into the category of kind of DIY support.
Yeah, the modern loss. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely not like traditional therapy, because I'm definitely not a therapist. I'm just like a person in the world who knows what grief feels like and knows that we need community around it. And somebody who knows that grief is an isolating experience, but it should not be lived alone. It should not be not shared. It should not be unexpressed. It should not be hidden in shadows. It should be something that you feel like you can talk about with a community, and you deserve to have people who are willing to like give you an ongoing invitation to talk about this stuff. And not just like, like we have people in our closed Modern Loss group, like our peer-to-peer support group on Facebook. And all the time there are some people who are like, I used to post a lot, but like, I haven't posted for a while, but now I actually need to post again. Like I hadn't seen that name for like years, and then they're like popping up again. And that's exactly it. Because you really do need to know that you always have people who got your back, who will see you. And that's cool. You don't need us for a while. No, fine. Like, no worries. Go live your life. But when you do need that conversation, you need to know that you can have it. And I think that when you know that you can have it, and you know that you can go to people, be it like total strangers online or certain people in your life who you're like, listen, I got to share what I'm going through. And, like, I hope you can see me in this and sit with me in this. Then I feel like it makes it easier to deal with all the other bullshit that comes along with living with loss, which is like interacting with the people who don't get it or who are going to put their foot in their mouths or do say something that's quite hurtful or, or just like deal with all the other collateral damage. I think that it does make it a little bit more bearable. It doesn't sting as much because that there are people who recognize how much this sucks and how hard it is.
Right. Well, okay. So that's a good segue then, because you've got another whole section on navigating friendships and social dynamics. And I'm curious why you decided to dedicate a chapter to that and what you think we should know about, like what are some ways grief can impact friendships? Because I think maybe people who are newer into this maybe haven't hit some of this yet. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that something that we don't talk about a lot is that grief can grief can impact friendships and sometimes not in a great way. I think that nearly anybody who goes through something really hard, like a really hard loss, is probably going to lose a couple friends. And that really stinks. But you might as well hear it than be totally shocked by it. And you'll still be shocked by it because it might be some people who you thought were your rides or die, like it might be some of those people. For some reason or another, some people just cannot handle this type of conversation, this type of experience. Maybe they wish they could fix it for you and they feel so overwhelmed that they can't, that they don't know. They're like, okay, well, I don't know how else to talk to you. Maybe it's bringing up something in their own grief. It's triggering something for them. Like maybe they just are not nice people, but like, I still believe in the inherent good of people. So I don't think that's the majority of people. I think that sometimes you got a bad egg in your circle and you need to get to a point where you're like, okay, this person is not making me feel good about myself. I'm going to draw some boundaries. Like there are some people who really do offer toxic positivity. They want nothing but like good vibes only, like it's all good. They don't want to know the mess, they don't want to really see you. They don't want to see you. You need to feel seen and you need to get rid of anybody who is really not making you feel good. Like that, I do know. Like if someone is hurting you constantly or you feeling like malicious against you or telling you something's wrong with you because you're grieving in the wrong way, oh my God, like maybe you don't get rid of them forever because maybe a lot of people do evolve and realize that they've said the wrong thing. But you get rid of them for the time being. You draw your boundaries, At the same time, I feel like the world deserves for everybody who's grieving to, have everybody else intuit exactly what they need at any given moment. But that's just not the way that we are, right? Like we're living in the third year of a pandemic. We're overwhelmed, we're overworked, we're burned out, we're grieving in so many other ways. And so it's really hard for every single person to think about all the people in their lives who are grieving and like check in at the perfect time with exactly what they need. So it does fall on us to figure out how to resource ourselves and reach out and say what we need and ask people who we think can give it to us to see if they can,
Yeah.
And not expect it all from the same person, because just like a partner, you're not going to get it.
Right. Okay, good. Well, thank you for going through that with us. And then you've got a whole section on trigger days, anniversaries, Hallmark holidays, something that I think you call diagnostiversaries, which is a word I haven't seen, but I love that word. Can you give us maybe a few tips for dealing with that, with those things?
Sure. So any one of them in particular?
Anything that strikes you. And also, actually, you mentioned something called a bespoke holiday. I was curious about that.
I'd love to talk about that. Okay. So yeah, I have a lot of advice in there about, dealing with, the days that are expected that might be kind of crappy, but then the days that are just regular days, that are also kind of crappy, and how you can kind of harness those days and do something with them that feels meaningful to you. And so I do love the whole bespoke holiday thing. And that basically is like, yes, like maybe you're focused on rebooting or reimagining Christmas or Hanukkah or like, I don't know, like Valentine's Day, right? But you can also create your own thing. And that kind of goes back to what I'm saying about you still have a relationship with this person. You can create your own holiday in their honor, in their memory. And you can actually make it a real communal one. One of my favorite ones is my friend Matt Fisher, who's a comedian in Brooklyn, and his sister died in a car accident. She was only, oh my gosh, she was probably like maybe 23 or 24 years old. And her name was Katie Fisher. And eventually his friends in the comedy community all got together and they were like, Katie was the most generous person ever. Like, and she always sent Matt homemade cookies every single week. She was like his little sister. Every week when he was at college, she sent him homemade cookies.
Wow.
And so they ended up starting this holiday called Katie Fisher Day. And it's on her birthday, which is, it was March, and I don't exactly remember which day, but they started posting on Twitter about it. They created a hashtag, Katie Fisher Day, and they started this thing saying like, listen, this is in honor of Katie. She died in a car accident. It's Matt's little sister. She was the most generous soul. She was so giving. She always sent Matt cookies. That's like an example of how loving and giving she was. And so on her birthday, if this story moves you, can you just bake some cookies for somebody and just send it to them? And so it sparked this whole global thing, like where by now, and send us a picture. And so they asked people like start posting it on social media. And so he's now seen pictures of like cookies sitting by the Nile and like in Uganda. And it's like so amazing because he has this visual, this proof that people are witnessing his loss. Yeah. And maybe they're not aware of who Katie was. Maybe they just like the idea of baking cookies for a stranger. But to him, how meaningful is that, you know?
Yeah.
And he really turned something that is very isolating and lonely, which is grief and loss, which will always be a lonely thing, you know, always, into something that is being lived communally.
Right.
And that's just awesome.
Yeah, that's terrific. Okay, great. Well, and so I'll refer readers to to that chapter, all kinds of tips dealing with all those Hallmark holidays and all those things. So that's terrific. I noticed that you end the book with some suggestions that the reader create their own grief manifesto. What's a grief manifesto?
Yeah, I mean, a grief manifesto is, basically what you deserve, like stuff that you, dear listener, deserve. You definitely deserve. I know I have a few on there. I don't have the book in front of me, but, I know that you deserve to feel seen in your grief. I know that you deserve to definitely, cut out people who are not making you feel good. You deserve to feel like you can share your own narrative, and care for your body and your mind. But it's like, what else are you entitled to? Like, you need to think about, like, we spend so much time in this culture, in this country, waiting for people to draw lines for us, to tell us like, oh, it takes a year, or you can take this much time off, or like, this is what we think you're due. Like, this is what we think that your grief deserves. But like, you need to get to a point where you're really resourcing yourself and saying, well, what do I need? What do I need? Like, what do I, Rebecca, need?
Right.
What do I, Jenny, need? What are my needs, and what are my rights? What do I deserve? And you need to write those down, and they'll come to you like on a rolling basis. It's not like you're not going to like sit down. I'm not asking you to write like 100, your whole manifesto, like, like the Rosetta Stone, in one sitting.
Right.
But it's something that is there to be something that evolves over time, because your needs might shift and your rights might shift. And I think that the practice of putting something down in writing is very, very helpful. To me, as a writer, it's very helpful. To me, as an editor, watching people write, I see how helpful it is for them to write something down. It kind of like makes it real, and it also like makes you hold yourself accountable as well. And especially in grief, like we all have grief brain. Even years down the line, we have grief brain. We can't be so sharp all the time. We can't remember every single idea that came to mind. And so that's why I want you to write this stuff down, because you might forget it and then you need to refer back to it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And also in the back of the book, I'm looking at these stickers here. Made it through today with a big old gold star.
That says it all.
Yeah. Some other really good ones. My person died and all I got was this lousy sticker. There's one that I wanted to ask you about. It is a crab. Why a crab?
Good question. Well, without giving too much away, there is an entire section at the beginning of the book that talks about like how I would like you to reframe how you approach, the whole like experience of adversity and dealing with adversity, right? And I basically talk about why I hate war metaphors when it comes to struggling with tough times. And I make a humble suggestion that one thinks of crabs instead. And then I go deep into why.
Nice. Okay. Well, we will have to read it to find out why. And then
I mean, isn't that interesting? Aren't you like, what the hell is she going to talk about?
Yeah. Crabs. And I should say, actually, I read that part, so I know what you're talking about, but I will tell listeners to go ahead and dive right in and understand that, and then grab that crab sticker in the back of the book, stick it right on your shirt, or I don't know, your laptop or someplace to remember that.
Yeah, I went. Yes, I felt that grief stickers were important in this book process.
Yeah. Well, and it's part of the book. Like I said, it's beautiful, and it's you can pick it up and read part of it, write a few things, put it back down, pick it up later, maybe jump around. It's So I know some people have mentioned they have grief brain and they don't feel like sitting down and reading a whole 300-page book that's full of words. And I should say this has, a good number of words, of course. It also has got lots of places, like you said, to write things. And it's got beautiful illustrations and sketches of things and little call out quotes and things. So it's not the kind of book that you have to feel like you have to sit down and go through from page 1 through page, whatever, straight through a bunch of dense words. There's plenty of opportunity
just like grief is a nonlinear experience, so is this book. So, use it how you need it.
Well, that reminds me, actually, you mentioned earlier in the book something about you're not a fan of linear stages models unless one of the stages was shit show, I think.
Yeah, true. That is true. Mm-hmm.
That is true. And I actually think you got something in the back with your stages head, which has like a whole bunch of different ones and arrows going all over the place and a kind of a humorous graphic there.
There's a lot of graphics. Those came out really nicely.
Yeah, they did. Okay, great. And you got a section on returning to work. There's a whole bunch of stuff here. So I'll put a link, of course, and encourage people to take a look at it. New book out this week. I also actually wanted to mention, you mentioned being previously in comedy and working for a comedy show, and I happen to know that was the Colbert Report, which reminds me of that amazing discussion, I'm sure you must have seen it, between Stephen Colbert and Anderson Cooper about how they both lost their dads when they were 10. And I'm going to put a link. It was a couple of years ago by now they had that discussion, but I'll put a link in the show notes for listeners because I think it's a really insightful discussion and a rare chance for people to hear these two grown men who lost their dads when they were 10 reflect on what that was like for them.
Yeah, that was a beautiful conversation. And I will say that Stephen really does know how to shepherd those grief conversations in ways that really move people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a moving conversation. At the time that it came out, I saw it shared on social media a lot, and people commenting how what a great discussion it was. And so I think it's time to maybe share that again because it has been a while since that first came out.
Mm-hmm.
Terrific. Okay. Well, I think we could keep talking about this all day today, but I think you've got a lot of great resources between this book, the Modern Loss Handbook, and then of course the essays in your first book, and then the Modern Loss Community. I'll encourage people to check out all three of those things. And just one question here to wrap up. If you could say one thing to grieving people, what would you say to them?
Cut yourself a break. Really? Cut yourself a break. And like, not just in those first several days or weeks or months, forever. Cut yourself a break. Don't compare yourself against where other people are, or where you perceive they are, because you don't really know what anyone else is going through. You don't really know where anyone else actually is. And so whenever you think that you're doing grief wrong, or maybe you're doing it right or what, just remind yourself that just be in the moment and cut yourself a break during the hard moments and know that they will pass. And in the good moments, the unexpectedly good and the hard fought for good moments, hold on to them as tight as you can, because, they're fleeting. But then again, so is the bad stuff too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to end. So my guest today is Rebecca Soffer, who's the author of the new book out this week, The Modern Loss Handbook, and also co-founder of the Modern Loss Community. So Rebecca, where can listeners find your books and find the Modern Loss Community if they'd like to learn more about your work?
They can find us at modernloss.com. Also, we have a newsletter, Substack, a newsletter, modernloss.substack.com. We are on all the social media channels at Modern Loss, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We have a really lively Instagram community. And yeah, like this book, which I'm really proud of. I hope you give it a chance to help.
And congratulations on launching it this week. And I'll put a link in the show notes so everyone can check it out. So Rebecca, thank you. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Rebecca Soffer as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 115. And please do grab a copy of Rebecca's new book, The Modern Loss Handbook, wherever you buy your books. And while you're there, remember to pick up my book as well, Future Widow. And most importantly, please reach out after you read it and let me know what you think. I would love to hear from you. If you're finding the Widowed Parent podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show at buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening. And until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.